Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's event is a discussion about QCC's 2023 Welcome Read book, the graphic memoir, March, Book 3, written by civil rights icon and Congressman John Lewis, with Andrew Aydin and illustrated by Nate Powell, both of whom are our featured guests today. And this event is a collaboration between the Kupferberg Holocaust Center and Queensborough Community College's English department. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the Indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, was first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocities and genocide. These horrors continue to have political, economic, psychological, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. This year's Welcome Read coordinators are QCC English professors, Dr. Beth Cunahan, Dr. Sybil White, and Dr. Ilse Schreinemakers. And moderating today's event is Dr. Cunahan, Associate Professor of English. Her interests include participating in high-impact practices like the Common Read and writing intensive classes, and working with colleagues to develop pedagogy and curriculum at the intersection of pre-college and college writing courses. Her work has been published in English Education, Community College Humanities Review, and the edited volume, What is College Reading? She launched the Welcome Read in 2021 in partnership with fellow QCC professors Dr. White and Dr. Schreinemakers, as well as the director of QCC's CUNY START program, Bonnie Flaherty. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Cunahan. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen, and thank you so much to Dr. Cohen and Marissa Hollywood and the support that you guys have always given us. We really appreciate the support of the KHC for the Welcome Read. So the Welcome Read we started in fall 2021 when we were still very much pandemicing, but some of us were back on campus. And we wanted to give students an experience in their first semester, whether they were taking credited courses or non-credited courses, to welcome them to the college and feel like here you are in the community. That's gotten easier as we've opened up more from the pandemic. So the first year we did March Book 1, and Nate was our speaker for the Zoom. Then with March Book 2, Andrew came in as well. And now we're very pleased to have both of them again for March Book 3. So I'd like to introduce both Andrew and Nate right now. Andrew Aydin grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. He's the son of a single mom. He's Turkish American. From 2007 until 2020, he worked with Congressman John Lewis in his office and was the creator and co-author of the graphic memoir series March, as well as the series Run. Andrew now is working on developing some interesting projects, including he did Registered. It's a comic book for the New York City Department of Education about youth voting, as well as he created a large-scale custom art installation, an online experience at Ben & Jerry's in Vermont called The Long March. And our other speaker, Nate Powell, who illustrated March, he's from Arkansas. He grew up in Arkansas, and he started self-publishing comics as a teenager in 1992, around the time that he was interested in being a punk rocker and played the bass in different punk rock bands. Nate is the first cartoonist ever to win the National Book Award, and his work includes the graphic essay / memoir, Save It for Later. And he's got some forthcoming work. A graphic novel called Fall Through is going to be released in February, and also a comic adaptation of the book by James Lowen, Lies My Teacher Told Me, is also coming out in 2024. So thank you very much. And thank you again for the support of the KHC for the welcome read.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. It's nice to be teamed up with Andrew again. And thanks everybody for attending this. Yeah, Andrew, how do you want to jump on into this?
Well, first, I want to thank Dr. Cohen and Dr. Cunahan for inviting us. It's great to be back. I think, maybe we'll skip the origin story since we've told that a few times here. And I think now y'all are reading March Book 3, which is, I think to Nate and I both, a work that tested us in many ways. There was so much pressure by that point after having, the success of March Book 1 and then March Book 2. March Book 2 won our first Eisner. And we also felt the weight of the story that we were trying to tell. There is a darkness for as violent and as difficult as the civil rights movement had been up until that point. When you finish March Book 2, there is a dark turn that takes hold both in the books and in the South. We looked at the context of the March on Washington through the lens of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, which is where we ended March Book 2 and where we began with March Book 3. And we did that because we felt it was important to show that the backlash to the March on Washington was immediate, that the success of the march and the push for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in many ways led to a heightened sense of agitation by the forces of white supremacy. And in opening March Book 3, I know Nate and I both really struggled with the right way to do this, because you're fundamentally opening a book with the murder of 4 young girls. And that raises a great deal of emotional challenges, but also ethical questions about what is the right way to tell this story. In building the scene, right? Because this isn't a scene that John Lewis was present for. And so this put a creative burden on Nate and I to make sure that it was not just accurate, but also respectful, and at the same time did not gloss over any of the horrible details of that moment. And so just from the research side and the writing side, I think you had a number of accounts that we could rely on. Some we even delved into were essentially like police reports and Department of Justice briefing materials after the bombing, but some of them were oral histories. One of the young girls that was murdered had a sister who survived, who recounted those last moments with her sister that we used in showing. And then in other ways, there's some parts of history that sometimes just shock you with, it almost seems like too much. Like if I was writing it, I would have to take pause and say, that's almost unbelievable. And I think one of those is when you see the outside of the church, they have this stained glass window with Christ in the middle. And the bombing did not blow out Christ himself, but blew out Christ's face. And I remember Nate and I were so impacted by that imagery that Nate made that the back cover of Book 2 to lead into this moment. And so just as you read this book, I think it's really important to understand why we set the stage there. Nate, I mean, you can talk about, I mean, you had to review and look at these incredibly painful photographs after the bombing.
That's true. And this is also in terms of, reading this as, as a work of literature, as a comic, and as history. This is where March occupies what wouldn't normally be that unusual of a space that it's simultaneously objective history and memoir. But especially when put through the medium and language of comics, the fact that Andrew and I, both in text and in image, are also mediating these first-person accounts and primary and secondary sources, there's a lot of accountability, and especially, as Andrew was saying, with the rawness and the implications for survivors of this moment, but also the fact that the murder of these 4 girls at 16th Street Baptist in Birmingham was also part of, sort of this long-term smoothening and mainstreaming of the overall narrative of the civil rights movement. And one of Congressman Lewis's most pressing concerns during the entire March trilogy, something that really increased as the book went on, was to undercut that sort of one-dimensional, convenient, linear narrative of the history of the civil rights movement. And so all of us, felt it was extremely important to humanize the people we were depicting within this scene, for example, and throughout the book. But that's where we found, I think, in real time, we were coming up against obstacles in actually finding out more about these people as individuals, which is interesting that March came along at a very convenient time, at a very fortuitous time for what we were trying to achieve in comics. A lot of this information that we were able to gain access to was only very recently becoming digitized and available online. And a lot of material was only very recently becoming declassified or available through Freedom of Information Act requests. And my go-to example, which applies in this first scene, is that this was on Youth Sunday in mid-September in 1963. And it was a huge day for point of contact and reconvening at the church. The church was packed with people and packed with young people. Importantly, Sunday school was going on at the moment of this attack. And as storytellers, this being history and memoir, there's an evolution in which so much of March Book 1 allows us to rely on John Lewis's first-person subjective account. Not only is 95% of this what he was seeing with his own eyes, what he was there for, but there was a lot less public documentation of events. And as the trilogy moves on, as we see the expansion of the movement beyond the ability of one person to experience and capture it, we are also seeing, understandably, an increased accountability to objective history. But as storytellers, we watched this gradual and then extreme sort of set of limitations, ethically speaking and creatively speaking, in being able to convey this history and convey these experiences while remaining historically accurate. And at this time, we were already a couple years deep into thinking into the future, thinking into now, and recognizing that our books, especially as comics, were vulnerable to legal objections, parental objections, and what has become a very powerful right-wing book ban campaign. So we basically recognized that one of our rules for ourselves was that, as a cartoonist, especially in March Book 1, there are moments where background dialogue, incidental dialogue, that's the kind of stuff that I get really into, just kind of filling in, because I like the chatter, the noise of the real world. And a lot of that stuff isn't consequential in a measurable way. But as the March trilogy went on, by March Book 3, we're like, okay, here's our rule. If we don't know that someone said something, we cannot put it in, even as incidental background dialogue. And so for the Sunday school lesson, we were like, the parents of several of these murdered kids were in Sunday school in a class at that time. And so our burning question was what was the Sunday school lesson? We could not find this out. And we were like, well, what do we do? We were trying to find a workaround for this crucial narrative moment I was looking for, like physical reference, and I was watching the Spike Lee documentary, Four Little Girls, which came out in 1995 and had a lot of interviews with folks. And finally, just watching the interview, because the transcript to the interview had never been put into text and then posted online in a searchable way, it was through the audio of the documentary DVD that I was finally able to hear a first person Sunday school attendee discuss what the topic of that Sunday school lesson was at the time. And this is the kind of stuff, like, I went to school for comics. I'm not the type of person who's like used to diving into rabbit holes and looking for basically where the black holes of information are to figure out where to look. And so that was a really good example of what we had to find ourselves doing over and over again throughout March Book 3 in order to fill in these gaps, which help provide a more accurate and complicated and enriching picture of what was happening from scene to scene in real life.
Yeah, and I think, Nate, you raise a really good issue too about like the construction of these scenes and where we had to bridge those gaps between the historic record and recreating a full scene. And I think about a little later on when John Lewis is in Mississippi, and that scene that you and I love so much about with the mosquito, right? It's page 79. And I'd originally written this as a one-page scene, and in John Lewis's other works, when he talks about this moment, he's like, we just went out and we were looking for him. We didn't know what else to do, right? But when you're making a comic, you can't, it's not enough, or it's not simple enough in storytelling, especially when you're trying to show the emotions rather than tell the emotions. You can't just make it flat. So I remember going back as we had this scene in there and asking Congressman Lewis, well, what was it like when you went out there? And he was just like, I don't know. There's a lot of mosquitoes. And so then, okay, great, perfect. That's the detail we need. So Nate then draws this beautiful scene of John Lewis just simply swatting a mosquito on his arm and the blood that you see. And it was originally written as one page. And then Nate adds that second splash page into the darkness. And it just says, as they say, do you see anything? And he says, no. And you see that darkness, right? And so you feel so much more out of this simple scene that's so important to the pacing of the book. And yet also in many ways is a perfect example of their powerlessness, right? It's a show rather than tell. We start the panel off saying we felt so powerless. We start the 2-page sequence off, but then we have to show it, right? But then you go into the next scene after that, and it's like, how do we quantify the danger, right? The murder of Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney and Andy Goodman is going to be revealed to you. But there was so much else, so many other incidents of violence that had been glossed over or pushed out of the headlines because of the media attention on their disappearance. So for us as storytellers, and also in building a complete narrative, then we have to have a scene that goes into that detail, and then it becomes a question of how do you show that rather than tell that, right? So we have John Lewis having a meeting, which we knew had happened, where he gets this daily report on, essentially calls into what is the Watts line report, right? Which was like a 1-800 number back in the day. That they use to consolidate. It'd be like reporting through an online forum the violence that happened on those particular days.
Which we have 11 incidents documented within a 24-hour period of time while trying to solve the disappearance and murder of these civil rights workers.
And that detail, each one of these reports is in fact the report from that he would have received that morning. But in order to do that, we had to go back and actually, because as Nate mentioned earlier, there was so many more records being digitized, we were able to go back and use crmvet.org and find the Watts line reports for those days and reconstruct this scene as accurately as possible to show you, as John Lewis is receiving the news as well, as he, for the reader, is the vehicle for receiving this information, actually the reports. And so you get this dramatic sense of like, it just feels like the world is coming down on him, which it was, but we're showing rather than telling, and having to use this essentially new technique of recreating actual historic events using primary documents and the memory of individuals to put you in the moment instead of just telling you, which I think is crucial when you wonder why March is different than a lot of nonfiction comics you've read. You have to understand this because we put you in the moment in each one of these cases. And so, you know, Nate, you might want to talk about this one, but I think about the other example of that is how we did the scene of Fannie Lou Hamer giving her testimony with LBJ in his office, right? Because all we had was an account of what LBJ said while he was watching it and Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony. But Nate does this unbelievable job of weaving the two into this intensely personal and lifelike scene.
That was one of the things I had marked looking through again. And it being a narrative matter of taking the information that you know is objectively backed up. And it's one thing to be able to, for example, to be able to read in Walking with the Wind, John Lewis's recollection of this in real time, sort of being backed up, by what everyone was seeing on TV from Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony. But this is a good example of like, because there's, most of the nuts and bolts of this book takes place in about 18 months. And so we have to be able to cram a whole lot of the passage of time, especially within just the Selma movement or within just the Mississippi Freedom Summer, into these blocks of time. And yet there are moments in which time comes to a standstill or in which it's necessary to move minute by minute through an incident. And so I think this wound up being about a 7 or 8 page sequence that was simply her testimony televised. I'm not aware of any other narrative that communicates this history that allows a reader to actually understand what it meant. When you read about historically, President Johnson broke in through the network broadcast of Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony to just talk about some BS to get her off the airwaves. And, we can be like, oh, that's messed up. But our understanding of it doesn't quite function the same way unless we know what it means to have LBJ also as a live television viewer and his growing sense of disbelief, of being flustered, of looking for people within the Oval Office, within his immediate staff to get something going, and him basically not having a game plan, losing control of the narrative by this application of democracy, by the testimony of Fannie Lou Hamer live on TV, and him being like, it doesn't even matter, just get me in front of the podium, get the cameras rolling, we've got to get her off the TV. And to recognize that within a span of minutes, the fact that her testimony never stops. She says her piece, and it is in front of cameras, even though he breaks it up on the broadcast. The fact that after he breaks up and he's like, oh, this happens to be the 9-month anniversary, almost on this very same afternoon of the assassination of President Kennedy. And he just kind of, lets his mouth go for a while. However, Fannie Lou Hamer is not aware of this. She is testifying in front of the cameras, even if the cameras aren't broadcasting. So we move back to her because she never stopped speaking her truth to this room of people and in front of these cameras. And so that was a moment where taking 8 pages to work in real time over the span of a few minutes radically shifts our understanding of what that meant historically to be seeing this on TV, or to be in the room, or to be in the White House at that moment. March Book 3 was the only of these 3 books also where we had a very tight page count limit. And a lot of this was simply because there was a lot more content, there was more going on. But we wanted this book to be $20 or less because we wanted it to remain accessible for readers at the broadest levels possible. So we're like, how many pages can we fit and still have it be 20? They were like 256. They're like, we got you covered. We had to make some really rough decisions because another one of our mandates was not to leave anything out. And so sort of blending that, the necessity of drawing that out in order to convey its power, convey its ramifications, but also going back to the mosquito incident and going back to the swatting of the mosquito that takes an entire page. There were a few moments like, because this is a dense read, without a little bit of breathing room like this for us as readers to gather ourselves, to reflect, it's really hard to dive back in at the same pace and keep going. And so we had to make a lot of tough calls in terms of what was worth a splash page, what was worth a breather moment, and what was worth, pushing the limits of balance between text and image in other parts of the book in order to make at least keep all the information there. So that provided, it's a unique set of challenges within the book, which sort of underlines that, yes, for example, the single panel, the minimal splash page of John Lewis just saying like, no, haven't found anything yet, was worth an entire page that could have been chosen, to be filled with other panels, with bits of other scenes. But it was worth it to be able to maximize the reading experience.
Well, and when you think about this as lessons in your day-to-day life, how many times have you seen a politician on television saying something that really doesn't need to be said? And I understand sometimes the most dangerous place in America is between a politician and a television camera. But start thinking about these things more critically. Like, these are important lessons when you see it, especially in moments of heightened national anxiety, of crisis. Like, ask sometimes what's not being shown. Ask what's not being said. If they choose to show fluff, why is that? Develop this critical literacy about what's happening in the world around you, because so much of our elected and political communications that we receive are tailored to make you feel something. And in that context, you have to ask yourself, am I processing this information and am I receiving it as a literate and aware human being? Or am I being fed something that's supposed to make me feel something or look away from something that I really should be looking at? And I think that's one of the important lessons too about March, particularly book 3, because we spent a great deal of time telling stories both in front of and behind the camera, right? You see, we use the end notes about telephones and spot imagery and things like that, because communication itself was so essential to the civil rights movement. And in that, I mean, even the scene in which John Lewis gives his speech at the Society of Newspaper Editors Convention in April of 1964, when he's announcing the Mississippi Freedom Summer. Right. I mean, this is a deliberate choice, not only because it is a key turning point in SNCC's less than favorable treatment by the news media, but it's also an example of how nonviolent civil disobedience works in an environment in which the media plays a dominant role. You had to go. I mean, like one of the fundamental tenets of nonviolent civil disobedience is that you state both what it is you intend to do and what it is that you have in mind for the solution. You have a proposal. It's not enough just to protest. You have to say why you're protesting and what you want as a result of your protest and what it is you're trying to dramatize. And so in order to do that, John Lewis goes to this convention where you have the big six and they're all there and Dr. King's there. And he lays it out. He lays it out plainly. And in that, I mean, that was actually also in connotations, another one of the strange historic coincidences, right? Where it's the first time he's seen Robert Kennedy since his brother's assassination, right? And the only reason we found that out actually, and that it's in the book, is because we unearthed photo negatives in the archives at the Library of Congress that had never been seen before of unused photographs where they just caught pictures of John Lewis and Robert Kennedy shaking hands and having a hug and kind of passing ships in the night in the middle of this convention, right? And it's that as you so when you're thinking about how you tell your own story too, think about that when you're doing your research is that you go into this with the things you think you want to tell, and then you find so many more things if you do your research right, because even this period of time that's arguably more studied than most in the 20th century, there are new things to find. The example that always comes to mind is this myth that has come about that Mahalia Jackson said, tell him about the dream, Martin, before he used the I Have a Dream speech. And I remember I worked on a project, a VR project, actually. We managed to pull the Universal Records masters of the audio from the March on Washington speech, because we were going to put this piece in the VR. And all of a sudden we realized it wasn't actually before the first time he said, I have a dream. She says it just after. You can barely hear it on the master, but she says it just after he says it, and it's almost like an amen. And so things in history, they either they can be forgotten, they can be overlooked, they can be exaggerated. And that's why when you think about what you're doing in your own classes with primary sources, and your teacher's taking you to the library and being like, okay, I want to see your primary source. That's why it's so important, because even in this arena where people have, won Pulitzers and every other manner of award, you'll find that there are things that can be reinterpreted, or that you can find new information that changes the account or the perspective, and debunks many of these myths. And I think when we looked at how we constructed our scenes, because we had to look at it with a level of detail that is unique to the comics medium, we came to find a different kind of understanding about the movement. And I think that's part of what I love so much about these books too, is because people think they know it. They think they understand it. Because we all grew up hearing the story of gods and kings, and we never heard the story of the young people until now. And we get to see it in a way that brings these details that Nate and I became so obsessed with. They're so important, because this movement can start to feel too distant, too removed, almost inhuman. And yet, when you go back and you read their notes and you see how they acted and what they did, you realize that they were not much older than you are right now, and that they had the courage of their convictions guiding them, but they were still young people, and they made mistakes, and they did incredible, extraordinary things all at the same time. And I think that's so important when you think about this, because I just go back to it over and over again, which is that you can never feel like the civil rights movement is impossible to do today. There are many things that have been undertaken to make it harder and more difficult for you to have that sort of success using nonviolent civil disobedience. And you have to understand that many of those changes actually came about because of the civil rights movement. So as you read March Book 3 and you learn about the Mississippi Freedom Summer and you learn about the Selma Voting Rights Campaign, and some of these things feel incredibly familiar. We're fighting over some of these exact same prohibitions on voting and the boundaries and the rules and the districts and everything else. Some things have changed, and they've changed in a powerful way. The way we communicate, the rules around it. We've seen in Georgia now they've tried to make nonviolent civil disobedience actually a terrorism charge. They've tried to conflate that. And I think, especially as we talk about here at this center about the role of anti-Semitism and racism in our society, these are the same tools that they tried to use during the civil rights movement and often didn't have the legislative or judicial support to implement. And now we're seeing them implemented on a national scale. We're seeing them implemented in states all across the country. And so keep that critical eye when you read this book. I don't know, Nate, I kind of gone on for a long time, but this is something important.
Well, bouncing off of that, I think please pardon my dog. I think the mailman is here. It won't last long, but I think where we have an intersection here, particularly with Holocaust studies and Holocaust memories, are that we began to see within civil rights movement history being the collective narrative absorbed and disseminated after the end of what Congressman Lewis is calling the end of the movement as he knew it. Beyond the movement of the 1960s, by the early 1970s, we were beginning to see the surviving, sort of smoother, flatter, more hierarchical, less complicated narrative of the civil rights movement began to emerge and kind of institute itself. Andrew and I are both Southerners. I was born in the late 70s. My parents are, white, middle class, lower middle class, Southern baby boomers. So, for example, I grew up learning the version of civil rights movement history that they absorbed as teenagers and as young people in Mississippi in the 50s and 60s, but also what they were taught by their community and their surroundings and what they internalized. And a lot of that is my elders' generation was not ready yet to unpack their baggage and deal with it. Thankfully, on a personal level, this is where March Book 2 actually allowed my parents to realize how much baggage they had to unpack and confront. And it became Book 2 became a powerful personal and emotional reckoning for my parents. It really hit them. But importantly, with these parallels between Holocaust studies and studying the history and experiences within the movement, we are at this crucial junction in American history in which we are losing first-person living memory on the ground, on the streets in the civil rights movement throughout the United States. And so we are at this junction, as I'm sure all of us know very well, in which it's easy to lose or gain control of which direction that narrative goes. And so we were very fortunate that we were able to work together with someone who was at the center of the movement as a young person. And importantly, there are themes which carry each of the March books along, but the most important theme, I think, which runs through March Book 3, is that of the messiness and the conflict within the movement. And that doesn't make it dysfunctional, but it's important to recognize that what we're watching in real time between 63 and 65 are factions and schisms growing that are both ideological and philosophical, and which are more strategic and tactical divisions growing within the movement. And we have a lot of heated arguments. We have a lot of boring logistical stuff that organizers within the movement are working out. We have a lot of people storming out of rooms and refusing to work together on some level. But importantly, we are showing that after these heated arguments and after these massive schisms, which are just beginning to kind of fracture, those same people are showing up the next day in the streets together. And so it's a recognition that the history of any people's movement, the history of any resistance, is always messier and more complicated and involves way more strains of thought and potential modes of action than history is typically prepared to accept. Like a lot of the book that I just finished, Lies My Teacher Told Me, that's really the central theme, is that most of the misinformation that is taught in our schools and in our history books is because of the perceived inconvenient nature of showing any degree of complexity or showing a victory as not being a complete victory. For us, that was the entire point. We like to underline it by underlining the truth that, for example, after the powerful speeches on the Alabama Capitol steps on March 25th, 1965, just hours after Dr. King's "How long, not long, because no lie can live forever" speech, Viola Luzzo was murdered driving a series of activists back and forth to their homes from the march by white supremacists on county roads in Alabama. This was happening on the same day, in the same county, a couple of hours apart. and this page itself is the end of the real time on the streets narrative happening within the movement. We go from there to the signing of the Voting Rights Act in August 1965. To us, the conflict, the messiness, the inconvenience, the ongoing necessity of work, the ongoing tragedy was the point.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Nate. I also think about like even that scene, right? We had to make that choice about how to show her death. I mean, we'd found the details. We sort of had a step-by-step account we'd piece together of how she was killed, and had to ultimately choose to do that as a single page, both for story reasons and just we didn't have, we were at that point, you know, they'd given us, okay, no more pages, boys. And I think about that where it's like we even acknowledge we had to make choices that as you read this book, you are a third person viewer that we have in mind the entire time. And we had to keep in mind the toll that some of this violence takes on the reader, and constantly question ourselves, is showing this violence helpful? Does it add depth? Does it make for a greater understanding? Or can we convey our point more simply, which is also one of the great strengths of comics. And with Nate's ability as an artist to show the car in an emotional context, like just a flat car, but with such detail and emotion, and using the tools of comics, not just the depiction of the car itself, but the ink wash around it and the way in which the text is presented. It allowed us to convey what we felt like we needed to convey while being respectful and not gratuitous. And I think as you read this, also take on those extra details. They are deliberate. They are for a reason, and read the text and the pages critically so that you understand the I don't want to call them tricks, but the tactics that are available in the comics medium to tell a story. I think back, there's a triptych that Nate often does to move something along when you have a voiceover or a narration or a dialogue. It happens in March Book 1, in the scene where Jim Lawson's talking about Gandhi, where he shows the different hands. It happens in March Book 3 in that scene we discussed earlier with Fannie Lou Hamer at the top of the page when we're about to transition to LBJ in the seeing it on television. Right? There's all of these ways in which we can show rather than tell, and develop that critical eye so that when you approach your own storytelling, you realize that human beings receive information in both a linear and nonlinear way, or in a symbolic and nonverbal way, and develop that critical eye for what you're perceiving then in your own life, and how the design choices and the method of a story being told to you is often deliberate to provoke or to inspire or to in some way influence your perception.
Which is funny because like part of the unique strength of comics is the fact that comics as a language, as a kind of literacy, works because it is often very immediate and intuitive. The fact that you're absorbing information and absorbing emotion, taking on perspectives without even thinking about it, you're automatically absorbing these things. However, at the same time, it is also very methodical. And so it means that if you are willing to process what's in front of you in a conscious, deliberate way, you are absorbing that a second layer, which is very much not intuitive, not immediate, which requires that reread often to recognize that there's a great deal of intention behind things, on top of the fact that, you know, comics art functions by being readily accessible and absorbable.
Yeah, so I think maybe now's a good place to take some questions now that we've put a lot
Yeah,
of
thank
comics
you.
on them.
Thank you. I was just going to suggest that because I was looking at the time, and it's just so wonderful to hear you guys talk, and you see how simpatico you are. And I can imagine how well you worked together and with John Lewis. So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A that I'll pose to you, and then I have a couple of more questions for you.
You bet.
All right, thank you. So a student asks, was it hard getting the police reports? So that was asked when you were talking about,
Oh, yeah,
yeah,
that's a good
getting the
question.
information.
Well, in some cases, yes, in some cases, no. Some of the groups working to digitize these records would be able to digitize large swaths of archives. So, for instance, the White Citizens Council in Mississippi, they were perhaps one of the best resources for us over time in terms of preserved documents and documentation of movements. And they collected all of these things behind the scenes, right? They would collect the police reports and the mug shots and all of these pieces. And you realize, first of all, how pernicious their activity was and pervasive it was. Because, I mean, this group of business leaders had access to all of these government documents. Like that alone is very alarming. And then in other cases, it's actually interesting in this modern context, right? The one I think of is the conversation between Robert Kennedy and Dr. King in the basement of the church during the Freedom Rides, right? And this is when they says it's going to be a deep, deep freeze. This is in March Book 2. Or he says there needs to be a cooling off period. And he says if we cool off any longer, we're going to be in a deep, deep freeze, right? And you kind of get these snippets of quotes. And for us, we really we needed that whole conversation. And so I dug into the Department of Justice's archives in that situation, who at that time was actually providing a tremendous amount of documentation from their archives from this period, digitally available and searchable, and ultimately found a full transcript of that conversation that we then used in that scene. But then a new president took control of the Department of Justice, or the presidency, and then his appointee as Attorney General began removing many of those records from the internet, and they were no longer available digitally. And so now I'm not sure that that's available. I've gone and searched for it several times and not been able to find it. It may end up being that March Book 2 is the only full recounting of that transcripted conversation available to the public anymore. And other cases, I mean, before I go too far down this rabbit hole, sometimes, I mean, I was calling libraries, I was calling city halls. There was a lot of cases where it was about persistence and networking through the archivists and the supportive individuals to find them. And I'm sure that there's probably more to be found.
Thank you. One question that's come up in discussions in my classes is, one of the reasons why we chose the March series was because John Lewis was a college student, right? And SNCC was all college students. And here we are at our college and all these new students coming in. And it's like, here you are transitioning from high school to be a college student. And now what change do you want to make in the world? But the practical question came up was, how can he be a college student and be this organizer, run SNCC, which, especially in March Book 3, when you're showing kind of the messiness of the meetings, but it's also they're following the Roberts Rules of Order, right? There's a real tight organization to everything just put together by these college students. So can you tell us what, because I know John Lewis ended up finishing his bachelor's degree after he got married at Fisk University, I believe. So can you guys just speak a little bit about how did he manage being both a student and an activist?
Well, a lot of that, I think, I mean, you know way better than I do, Andrew, but I think in a nutshell, a lot of it has to do with the arc of the like rapidly expanding scope and scale of the movement. So if he started college as a 17-year-old, I think in fall 57, the fact that, through 1961, he was still like by far, like until the Freedom Rides, a local student activist and organizer in Nashville itself.
Right.
And so it's, you know, like part of this story is recognizing that at a certain point he escapes the limitations of functioning within the role of a single city's, you know, one of many activists.
Well, I think part of it also had to do with the fact that he took sort of in the modern era a non-traditional academic route.
Mhm.
On the one hand, you know, at American Baptist Theological Seminary, the first school he goes to where he meets Jim Lawson, he was only pursuing an associate's degree, right? So it was a like he actually missed his graduation in May of 19. And this is the other thing, like look at the timing of these protests, right? I think about this in the context of my own life of like people being like, oh, you worked in Congress in college? I was like, well, yeah, but I worked when I wasn't at school. I would go on the breaks and I would work that week between Christmas and New Year's. Like even the stand-in campaign, right? Like that's Christmas. They've had their exams, right? And I think in some ways you can actually, it would really be an interesting paper to look at how the academic schedule influenced the early days of the student. But then remember too, he goes to Fisk to ultimately complete his bachelor's degree after the Freedom Rides with a scholarship from Dr. King. And then, but Fisk University is in Nashville, but he moves to become chairman of SNCC in June of 1963. So he did 1 year at Fisk University between 61 and 62, or I'm sorry, I guess he did 2 years, right? 61 to then 61, 62, and 62, 63 academic year, right? Which is also when you don't see as many John Lewis led or John Lewis participating protests. And we talk about that a little bit in the context of book 2, where he's like, I felt a little weird being on campus. Like everybody knew who I was, right? That like I felt like this actually in Congress after sort of the March books came out, because it was like they're like, why are you still here? Shouldn't you just be like off authoring? And I'm like, no, this is where the fight is. I'm not leaving John Lewis, you know. And I think he went through that in some ways in that time at Fisk, and when we talk about it. And then so I think it's important to read all 3 books so you understand this context. And then when he moves to Atlanta in 1963, he's no longer a student. He's a full-time manager, right? Or a full-time chairman. But I think about this, this also raises a really good point, which actually, let's connect this to student loans, right? What would happen to a student in this day and age? You've gotten your associate's degree, you go to finish a bachelor's degree, but you step away to participate in the civil rights movement. You would have all of your loans come due. And imagine if you had to pay that. John Lewis was making $10 a week as chairman of SNCC. And I talked about earlier about these creeping tactics that make it harder and more difficult for the movement like that to exist today. And this is a perfect example, because if you wanted to step away and you hadn't completed your bachelor's, or even if you had and you wanted to do it immediately after finishing that degree, that student loan payment would come due. And the reason I believe that we've made college so expensive in this systematic strangling of state resources, cutting them back, particularly in southern states, right? Georgia, North Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, we have made public universities more expensive and requiring student loans to graduate. It is in many ways to prevent you from being like John Lewis and going and making $10 a week as chairman of an organization like SNCC, and then being able to lead a movement in your youth.
I guess after doing the series of books, how did that affect you? How you perceived these different figures afterwards, you know, after doing the research and putting the book together? Did you look at certain people in the book differently, whether they were activists or politicians? I know for myself, reading the scene in March 3, where John Lewis is sitting down and talking with President Johnson, I was just so appalled at how rude and crude President Johnson was, which I only knew just a little bit, but actually seeing those words, it just threw me off. So for
we
both
cleaned
of
it up a little
you,
bit too.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, I think you raised a good question, and Nate, you can speak more about this, because I had this weird life of knowing them. You know, I mean, like I actually did this thing where when I would see, like I knew CT Vivian pretty well. I got to know Reverend Lawson pretty well. He helped me with my graduate thesis in the history of Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story. I met Fred Gray on several occasions. Julian Bond and I actually, this is a really strange story, but he would, John Lewis and Julian fell out after the 86 campaign. And the first time they really had done something together in all those years was the Civil Rights Summit at the LBJ Library in 2014. And I went with the congressman because they invited us to do a book signing. And I remember being in this room of all these people who I felt, just totally intimidated by, right? Bill Clinton was in there, Andy Young, Mavis Staples, Julian, John Lewis, others. And Julian sees me and he walks straight across the room at me. And I was like, I screwed something up in one of the books. Like, that's my first thought, right? Like, he's coming to correct me. And instead he comes up and he goes, I wrote a comic book first. Huh. And I'm like, yeah, I know. Right. Like, because he wrote that 1966 comic book about Vietnam. And we exchanged numbers and we would text and call. And then when John Lewis's birthday came up the next year, he called me and he said, I don't want you to pick up. I need to leave a message for my chairman. And he left this wonderful birthday message for the congressman on my voicemail to play for him, because I think he actually felt a little weird still about calling him directly. But like the comic book nerd, like, fine, okay, we'll use him as a vehicle. And I was more than happy to be in the middle of that. And so, then I play it for him and he starts off, Mr. Chairman, in his deep voice, and it was kind of this beautiful thing. And then of course, Julian passes away the next year. Mm-hmm. And so I think, sure, yeah, there's some where we're like, okay, but also there was a real humanizing of these folks, especially as we got to interact with them. C.T. Vivian, I saw him, probably just a few months before he passed. And he said the same thing he said about me every time. He goes, hey, comic book man. And that was like how they would see me, like all of them. They're like, yeah, he's a comic book kid, right? That hangs out with John Lewis. And it's like a really nice, like the fact that they would remember you and give you a nickname and all that sort of stuff like that. It's like you're part of the club, even if you're like the junior most member of knowing them, there's that level of respect. And they really, like, it became like Nate and I get this same feeling in comics where we don't live near a lot of the people we work with or we enjoy being with in a professional capacity. And we get together at these events, whether they're conventions or summits or things like that. And that's where it's like a reunion. And then you see everybody clump back up. And it was almost the same thing watching them after all these years come back together. And I think I really worry and I feel a heavy burden about the fact that I'm one of the few living people who knew them in that capacity and who knew the way they were as human beings. And as time marches on, they will inevitably be lost to the historic record, which also makes what we did with them so important, and the care and the amount of effort and all of those late nights and weekends and everything we put into these books to record not just the when, where, and how, but the human beings as best we could.
I've got nothing to add to that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now, another question was about the editing. So you had to work with the certain number of pages, and you spoke a bit about, choices that you made, but what about some of the things that got cut? What were some of the difficult choices and choosing what not to put in?
There are about like 7 to 10 pages that he wrote, I drew, finished, that had to be snipped. A couple of those were redrawn so that we could like take a 3-page sequence and then finish it as 2 pages, etc. But 2 of the sequences that some of them were inconsequential, like setting up the immediate aftermath of Obama's inauguration in 2009, as part of our framing device, and being like, no, this page has got to go. We got a lot to cover. But there was a moment early on that was going to be around 28 or 29 in book 3 that was the almost public murder of Ivanhoe Donaldson, an activist, in public, in broad daylight, in a police car by a uniformed police officer, with eyewitnesses. And in fact, the only reason he wasn't murdered by this cop was that the cop's partner stopped him and simply said, like, not here, too many witnesses, in front of the witnesses, with a gun pointed at Ivanhoe Donaldson's head. And that was actually, to me, that was by far the roughest one to realize that we were like, that was really the cusp there, where it was such an important scene, and yet we could not rationalize, because it did not have a direct connection to the like, I'm going to use this word, though it sounds crass in this context, the plot driven narrative arc that we were following. We were so crammed in, we had to be like, I hate to say it, y'all, we got to drop this page. And like, a lot of the stuff that happened in 2009, one reason was because Andrew was an eyewitness to all of this within the Capitol Rotunda at the U.S. Capitol. So there was a setup to the post-inaugural lunch that Andrew got to witness, where, John Lewis is sitting, eating lunch with people, and basically talking about, like, yeah, more or less like, people have thought I wasn't cool, for a long time, and serving as a segue into the movement of him beginning to fall out of favor with this sort of up and coming young factions within SNCC. And there was some really cool stuff in that sequence too, and just having to be like, maybe some other time. Anything come to your mind, Andrew?
No, I mean, I think the biggest question was always how much space we could give something to, right? Like, we've talked about that in a few different capacities, where we had to make difficult choices about, in some ways, the relative importance to John Lewis's narrative and the overarching narrative, and whether that made sense from a pacing perspective or from an overall page perspective. Because it would be easy or gratifying to show every detail, but that's also part of our responsibility, because if we tell you a story that had every piece of information we found, you'd never get through the whole thing. We have to be your guide.
I'm gonna tie this all together with Rosa Parks.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect.
So when making these difficult decisions about what needed to be cut for space, and tying that into that minimalist splash page of the mosquito and no, tying this into recently made available Freedom of Information Act requests, and for information that was never transcribed or digitized, that was not searchable, 2 days before we had to send this book to the printer, we had already finished, and we were like just fact checking everything. We were working literally 24 hours a day between Andrew, our editor, Lee Walton, and I, getting the whole thing done. And we woke up like 6 a.m. Lee had sent us an email that was like, dudes, what would you say if I told you that at the big series of speeches on the Alabama State Capitol steps at the end of the book, what if I told you that Rosa Parks, the mother of the movement, also spoke, and no one has ever covered in a book or ever documented it? What would you say? And we were like, that's insane. What are you talking about? So he was just fact checking what was going on during the speeches. And we knew about all these other speakers and everything. We could back all that up with evidence and photo and all this stuff. Lee had gained access through Freedom of Information Act requests to the FBI and their COINTEL program, who had spooks all over the crowd. There were FBI agents interspersed all throughout the crowd, recording, taking pictures, finding out who was attending and in what capacity. And so there is audio recording of this entire exchange you see in March Book 3 with Rosa Parks' speech on the steps. And basically they recorded it on a tape recorder, magnetic analog tape, and they, put it in the Indiana Jones style archives. At a certain point, someone in the US government digitized it into an MP3 and just saved the MP3, but it was never transcribed or converted to text. So you don't know if it's there unless you're looking for exactly that thing at exactly that moment. So Lee became the first human to ever transcribe Rosa Parks's words into text. And this book became the first book to ever reintroduce the fact of her presence and her speech into American history and into Black history. And so 2 days before it went to the printer, it was a moment where we're like, oh, stop everything. And I literally cut up 2 pages with scissors and put them on my light boxer to like trace out a new set of panels for her speech so that it would fit with only 1 additional page added, which meant that we had to cut 1 page. And I think that's actually where Ivanhoe Donaldson where we made the choice to cut that scene because of the historical significance of Rosa Parks being folded back into this moment to bookend the movement as a whole.
So that was really down to the wire too.
It was. Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
but important to have that in. I think for the last question, I want to go back to maybe about the perspective, the art, and your choices and what you guys decided how to portray something. So a student wrote the question, how on pages 36 to 41, illustrating the voter registration period in Dallas County, and the panels are more focused on portraying the legs and the feet of the people rather than their faces. So what was your thinking behind that, Nate? And Andrew, was that also part of your decision as well?
Look, that's a very good observation. That's really like using comics eyes on the comics. And you're right, it is really focused because like the whole point of this scene is noticing that the line did not move and that I don't think anyone successfully registered, but only a few people were even able to see the registrar. It's about the fact that people's 2 feet are planted on the ground. And as it gets hotter and nastier, these pleas for water and food, so that those feet aren't losing their strength. So that is one side, that there's a narrative value to showing the feet on the hot concrete. The other more practical consideration is that like this entire book was drawn and lettered and finished in less than 9 months. From 0 pencils to a finished book. It was extremely intensive. We were all working together very quickly to get it done and get it done right. But there were a lot of sequences where I was working typically 6 days a week and was getting about 10 pages a week done. So typically I would do 2 finished pages every single day, and then prepare that night by penciling the lettering and fact checking for the next 2 pages. And so at a certain point, especially doing a book like this with hundreds of characters, all of whom I need to try to be as respectful and historically accurate as possible, but it's full of crowd scenes. And at a certain point, you're like, how do I convey this information in the best way possible without getting bogged down by being like, oh, here's another scene with 200 people. So, every once in a while you use shortcuts. And if you do them right, they don't read as shortcuts because they also function as, strengthening the narrative by focusing on an element that you can actually gain something from. Case in point, where, if you keep on relying back on the throngs of people shot after shot, that becomes a blur and it becomes forgettable. It loses its narrative impact.
Just theorizing, but it occurred to me, this would have also been mid to late 2015, right? And we had been doing quite a number of events. And this is also when, as our speeches evolved that went along with these events, We had started using, sometimes the congressman would take it and use it, that the paraphrasing of that Dr. King quote, that there's no sound more powerful than the marching feet of a determined people. And that it somehow that had come to be somewhat of a mantra for us by that point. And I wonder, and I don't presuppose to know how that influenced you, but I mean, it almost, I could totally see that creeping into, like, okay, this is one of the ways we solve these problems. If that's our mantra, here's how we do it visually.
Well, that is a good point. The fact that, like, as you already brought up, our ongoing visual theme of like telephones and sources of mass communication connecting people, both through the historical parts and in the 2009 eras, like there are other sets of repeating visual themes connecting everything in the book. And each one of those sort of developed organically over the course of the book. Usually pretty early on, we would recognize that this is going to work, or this is just going to keep happening, so let's lean into it. But I mean, I'd say as early as, 2012, when I did the cover of book one, it was fairly obvious that like this kind of like medium shot from the knee down that allows us to see a great depth of field as people are in motion or people are doing something together as activists was going to be leaned on a lot during the course of it. So I'd actually say that's also one of those moments where it's not limited to scene or even book, but at a certain point, it's like if you see, like this is the musical analogy here, is like if you see something repeated or hear something repeated in music like half a dozen times, it might get like boring and might seem kind of lazy. And if you do it 50 times, it becomes intentional repetition and gains this entirely new meaning and context.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both very much. So appreciate it. And I wish you guys could see here how at the college we're lifting up out of the pandemic and coming back to life. Reading the March series every fall for the past 3 years has really helped the faculty and the students, inspiring us and really keeping John Lewis alive, not his memory, but him. I think that's what you guys have really achieved and that you're able to bring to everyone. So thank you so much.
Of course, we feel exactly the same way. And it's our honor to kind of be in this position where we are, helping keep his spirit, his mandate, but also his beautiful self alive in our hearts and minds.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Nate. I was listening and there were so many things that you all said that really just resonated, even from the toll of the violence, even on the reader, how you constructed the narrative of the book and all of the research that you did. And at one point, talking about the condensing of narratives and the simplification of narratives, and also things that are lost to the historical record, especially as more people are passing away. And all of this is relevant, not only in Holocaust education, but it just reminds me that when we're thinking about young people now and people who are taking up the charge as activists and as researchers and as practitioners in this field, that there's always new lenses that we're bringing to it. And I just want to thank you both on behalf of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center and Queensborough Community College. We're so grateful. And I also wanted to say, Andrew and Nate, I had other ideas. So you're very much part of the Queensborough Community College family. And thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in today. We hope you stay safe and well. Thank you.